Twisted Metal 2. Now this is a game. Twisted Metal 2 in many ways is the peak of the series in my opinion, and one of the better games on the PS1. This is one of those games I bought during a period of time when I was just buying retro games with any sort of name brand recognition behind them, even if I had no interest in the franchise. So while I was doing the rounds on Craigslist one day during a cursed amount of years ago, I bought it along with some other games, but I really had no interest in the series beyond it being something I'd heard of. So my copies more or less sat on the shelf for the better part of a decade. I'd attempted to play it a few times, but I never got into it, and usually I quit after a few levels. It wasn't until I'd really gotten into Twisted Metal Black a few years back that it and the rest of the series really started to click with me. But this one in particular really stuck out to me in the grand overall scope of the series, because like I said, it is a game. Twisted Metal 2 apparently had 16 months of development, which was significantly longer than what the first game got. That plus the benefit of hindsight that they had really makes this come across like the true completed vision of the series brought to fruition. This immediately comes across in the presentation, which has had a major facelift. The first and most notable example why are these cutscenes. Gone are the minimalist text scrolls that even the classic Mortal Kombat games would look at and say were a bit low-key. In their place, we have these really fun and charming minimalist motion comic cutscenes. I kind of wish they were fully animated, but that was probably a bit too out of the budget. Still, the art is nice and just brimming with personality. The personality is further driven by the voice acting.
I'm a bit of a junkie, addicted to death. Every moment I am without a soul, I get weaker. My job is too hard.
This is one of the better vocally performed games up to this point. This was only 1996, don't forget, the same year as the original Resident Evil and its laughable voice acting. Plus, it was still a few years before the likes of Metal Gear Solid, so Twisted Metal 2 was relatively ahead of its time in this regard. A lot of these cutscenes were carried by the absolutely sumptuous voice of Calypso, who is played by Mel McMurrin, who brings a level of campy richness and a smug, humorous charm to the role, which makes Calypso an absolute joy to listen to.
I face a dilemma. Where will this year's Twisted Metal contest take place? 14 of the world's best combat drivers have already been chosen, ready to battle to the death in hopes of becoming the victor and claiming whatever prize their brave hearts desire.
It's a shame Mel never got too many roles beyond Calypso. He clearly had talent, and the rest of the performances aren't anything I'd sneeze at either. I'm not too sure if the campiness to a lot of the voice acting is intentional or not, but it definitely adds a lot of charm to this game, as well as does a good job at bringing across the necessary points. 2005's tournament was such a rousing success that Los Angeles was completely destroyed, so now it's Christmas Eve 2006, so 1 year later and they haven't even bothered to try and fix the damages to LA, or even put out the fires? Civic funding, am I right? It's also kind of a ballsy thing that they decided to depict Los Angeles being destroyed in a game made in 1996, only 4 years after the Los Angeles riots. Calypso decides that last year was such a success that the only way to top it with this year's tournament is to make this year's tournament worldwide, which is a pretty natural way to escalate things. There's really not much to the story, although there is a prequel comic which I did a video on that explains Calypso's backstory and how he went from a small-town kid with a Jeffrey Dahmer-level roadkill obsession to an all-powerful god-like being. It's not required reading, but it does help fill in a lot of the blanks and retcons some of the elements from the first game that they decided they no longer wanted to have as part of the established lore. Otherwise, the story gets in and gets out with no fat on the bones in order to put you straight into the action, which is perfect for the game that they're presenting. Now, another one of the things that really sells this game to me as the first game's concept brought to fruition is the character roster, because they pretty much established a base roster of vehicles and characters/character archetypes that would go on to define the rest of the series. Vehicles like Shadow, Mr. Slam, Grasshopper, Twister, and Axel, as well as recurring characters like Mortimer, Marcus Kane, Amanda Watts, and, well, Axel. It feels like they have a more defined identity, which really makes this game feel more cohesive, rather than what it could have potentially been, just a grab bag of ideas. Even the characters who are returning feel closer to how they would be presented for the rest of the series, like Mr. Grimm. who is less of a mysterious antagonistic force who has it out for Calypso and is more of a soul junkie who only does the reaping thing to satisfy his cravings. It kind of feels more tongue-in-cheek. As a matter of fact, I think that kind of goes for the entire presentation all around. This game has a sense of humor about itself that really wasn't all that present in the first game. Or at least they couldn't quite convey it as well through text scrolls, and I really enjoy this game's tone. It's darkly comedic, it's campy, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, but still grounds itself in a level of its own reality. It doesn't go too whack, it finds a balance, so it allows comedic cutscenes to exist alongside the more dramatic or messed up cutscenes. Structurally, this game is like most of the rest of the series. You select one of any number of different colorful characters with different stats and unique special attacks, and you play through the story mode. Then you get a character-specific ending once it's all said and done. It's not a structure that really needed to be changed. It's your classic arcade fighting game setup. But unlike last time, I wouldn't necessarily say that you can make it through with most of these characters on your first go if you're any good. You can get through easy mode well enough, but that's a complicated matter that I'll discuss in a moment. I think this game's cover boy Axel, in my experience, is actually the best character to start out with. He has decent health, decent speed, and a special that's actually pretty useful. It's short range, but it's a shockwave, so all you need to do is get near someone and set it off, and it's guaranteed damage. Plus, because it's short range, they have it regenerate quicker than some other specials. I actually have a theory that they intended Axel to be the new face of the franchise, or at least they were intending every game to have their own main star. Obviously, Sweet Tooth was the star of the first game, but he's conspicuous by his absence from the base roster in this game. You have to put in a code to even unlock him, which before the average household had internet, you'd only find out if you, by chance, fell off a ledge in the New York level at the correct angle. Or alternatively, you could pick up one of these pricey strategy guides. Yeah, I was at a local game shop when I was on vacation recently, and I found this for $30. Nothing I don't already know, but it's still pretty cool to have. And in my opinion, it's the worst rendition of Sweet Tooth, including the lesser games in the series, because his design sucks, he's not particularly easy to use, and his ending sucks. Plus, there are no level warp codes for Sweet Tooth or Minion for that matter, so you have to play through the entire game on 3 lives, no exceptions, making him kind of obnoxious to play as. So it seems like they were going out of their way to make sure people didn't pick Sweet Tooth in favor of Mr. Poster Child, which I guess is fair enough. Maybe they would have made another new character the face of Twisted Metal 3 had that game not been handed over to a new developer and they just defaulted back to representing the most iconic character. Failing Axel as a first playthrough, I actually think Warthog is a good go-to because he has a really good special as well as a supreme amount of health. His speed suffers, but as long as you have turbo at your disposal, it's not that big of a deal. Generally, you'd probably want to prioritize health over anything else. In any given level, you're going to be fighting a lot more people on average than the first game, so you're going to be getting bum rushed a lot more often. So characters like Twister and Mr. Grimm require a more specialized skill set that you have to work out. So this game definitely delves a little bit deeper into the philosophy of having every character play subtly differently, but once you get down to brass tacks of how the game plays, I think arguably this is the best in the series in that regard. I know I already said that about the first game, but here's something you need to keep in mind about my opinions of the entire Twisted Metal series. 1, 2, and another game we'll cover down the road basically play perfectly for what they are. So everything else is in a competition against those 3. But if you put a gun to my head, I think 2 plays better than 1. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an expert when it comes to describing how driving games play. I'm not exactly in tune with the terminology, because for me, driving is a pragmatic exercise. But Twisted Metal 2's engine to me comes across as a more refined version of Twisted Metal 1's engine, so you still have that balance of arcadey driving where you can make tight turns and pull off ridiculous stunts while still feeling like you're in control and have a level of weight and realism within the world. The physics in particular have definitely been refined. It feels heavier and more realistic in how the vehicles move. It's definitely not on the level of what your average racing game feels like, but they definitely made an effort to move on the spectrum of realistic versus arcadey closer to the side of realistic. Enough that it feels really good to drive. You really feel like you're in control of these vehicles, and I think the physics generally feel more organic in that it feels like your movements, especially when airborne, feel less rigidly determined. You flip around and move in a way that feels more true to how you would if this were real life, but it still understands exactly what kind of game it wants to be. If you make it too heavy, that can be the kiss of death in that it will potentially make it feel like you're fighting against the game in order to navigate and fight, which in a game that requires fast reflexes can make things frustrating. Meanwhile, if you make things too light, you risk having characters and cars that neither feel real in the environments that they occupy and fly around at the slightest bit of acceleration. This will be important later on. So it's good that they managed to nail that balance of control versus realism, and that, along with the organic feeling driving and physics, really nails the feeling that the engine needed. That's really the word that comes to mind when I describe this game. Organic. How it feels to move, how it feels to fly through the air, how the cars feel, how the momentum feels. Everything just feels right. It can be a bit slidey at times in that when you make a handbrake turn, you can slide for ages at times, and vehicles with better handling have a tendency of almost handling too well, so you might have a hard time getting used to the specific timing of turning, but it's completely manageable. Otherwise, the controls and gameplay have a good smoothness and intuitiveness that makes it feel good to drive around and attack, and gives the game a real pick-up-and-play quality that's very easy to learn and hard to master. There's a responsiveness to the action that makes the central gameplay loop very compelling, and the act of laying into your opponents with a sequence of well-timed attacks never gets old. There's a philosophy of more but better with Twisted Metal 2 that permeates through everything they do. It just feels like a bigger and better version of the first game that is near enough an upgrade in every possible way. There are a few things that I don't fully agree with, like how they took away the healing pads in favor of healing pickups. I don't know, I just find the recharging healing stations to be more convenient. What can I say? They also got rid of the aggressive pedestrians who shoot at you, which I'm of two minds about. I liked them as an addition because I found that it cut out the fat, so there's no dead space in the action. But I'm also fully aware that a lot of people found them annoying, so I'm completely aware that I'm in a minority here. With that said, if the pedestrians were a tool to keep the action alive at all times, they do a good job at that generally with the increased number of cars per level. And they seem to have it where each car is programmed to behave subtly differently, like how Twister has a tendency of being up in your face, whereas Sweet Tooth tends to be low-key and opportunistic. So you can rarely rest because everyone is going to be fighting you from different angles in such a way that you don't need an extra additive to keep the action flowing at all times, because this game certainly is all action all the time. The difference in AI behaviors may have also been a thing in the first game, but I really never noticed. But as far as improvements, I'd say there are two game-changing additions to this game. You have a new and, more importantly, bigger selection of levels, and they're each completely and utterly distinct. What with this game's subtitle being World Tour, each level is in a completely separate region of the world and has a completely different feel thematically, graphically, and gameplay-wise. Such as the multi-leveled Paris, where you can gain roof access by blowing up the Eiffel Tower. The dynamic Antarctica, where pieces of the polar ice caps will collapse, changing the arena in real time and forcing you to act frantically in order to avoid falling in. Then you have the sprawling and varied New York level, with several wide-open outer areas and several unique and claustrophobic indoor areas. And uniquely amongst PS1 games, in tight areas, the camera manages not to spaz out on you. Then you have a couple of small, more pure experiences that don't attempt any sort of grand gimmick with Moscow and Holland, both of which make for some frantically intimate gameplay. You'd think by having more empty levels that would hinder the fun, but they managed to keep a good enemy to size ratio regardless of the level size, so even the bigger levels are busy until you get down to the last few enemies, which makes Holland a really great level because they have no less than 9 separate enemies for you to fight. It's chaos in its purest form, and it's a blast. But my pick for the best level in the game, nay, the series, is definitely the Amazonia level, aka the Firewalk, utilizing tight narrow platforms suspended in pools of lava to achieve very tight design despite being one of the bigger levels in the series. The lava slowly damages you, so if you can handle taking the damage, it makes a perfect exit strategy if things are going pear-shaped, creating a perfect risk-reward system unique to this level. Plus, it has several unique areas and several secrets for you to open. It's everything great about the Twisted Metal experience concentrated and put into one level, and that's not to mention the boss, although I won't mention that just yet. The only two levels that I'm not over the moon about are first of all Los Angeles, which is the opening level, and open is certainly a word to describe it. It's a little too open and a little bit too plain, but definitely perfectly acceptable. Still has some uniqueness with the fire pit, the surrounding highway, and so on. It's an upper tier level as far as the overall series is concerned, but something's gotta take the wooden spoon. And if any level is going to be more bland than the others, it might as well be the one you start with. That way you're not overwhelming the player right off the bat. The other level I'm not too fond of is the final level, Hong Kong Crunch. So this game is bookended with its two worst levels. Granted, Hong Kong Crunch I think is still better than Los Angeles, but something about it just never clicked with me as well as the other levels. I guess I find the city street layout kind of big and bland. Most city-based levels in the series attempt to make them more than just plain cities. And the Hong Kong Crunch level has three interesting set pieces that elevate it. The waterfront, the subway, as well as the indoor area, but the majority of it is taken up by the grid layout of the city streets. But still, even though not every level hits it out of the park to the same extent, this is still the best and most classic selection of levels in the series bar none. The additional number of levels, as well as general level size and enemy count, means that Twisted Metal 2 is significantly longer than the first game. Probably about double its length, but it's still by no means something you'll get tired of by the end. At about an hour and a half per playthrough, it's more of a commitment, but still is a pretty good length for the type of game that it is. Then the other major game-changing addition is the weapon selection, which is nothing short of iconic. They cut most of the weapons from the last game, minus the main three missiles, and introduced a host of weapons that would become instantly synonymous with the series. The bouncing bomb Ricochet, the flying incendiary Napalm, the massive planted explosion called Remote Bomb, the environmental lightning attack, it's all here, and between all this, as well as the revamped special attacks and the returning missile weapons, it creates a set of weapons where there's something for every situation. There's absolutely no redundancies to this weapon selection. The important thing about these games is to recognize the importance of offensive items versus defensive items, because your inventory is finite, and so if you have a bunch of defensive items strewn about, it's entirely possible to have a bunch of defensive items and nothing to do with them, and while they're clogging up your inventory space, you might not have enough space for a decent arsenal of offensive items to take out your enemies. That happened to me a number of times in the first game, and that's where I think the most genius addition to Twisted Metal 2's weapon selection comes in, the power bar. Instead of having defensive items as selectable items, you have in its place a system wherein all the abilities that would have been defensive items are now done by using button combinations similar to cheat codes. And each ability will use up a different amount of your power bar, which recharges over time. You have the rear fire ability, which doesn't use any energy and can be used with any weapon. Praise be to the gods that they realized that a rear fire item should not be a selectable item. Then amongst some of the other abilities you can use, you have a shield, a mine, a freeze blast, and invisibility. All of which are good defensive abilities to have around and have access to at any given time, depending on your energy level. It's genius because it completely separates the two different types of items into two completely separate categories, meaning that one never gets in the way of the other. Personally though, I'm headstrong as a brick, and sometimes in the heat of battle, the game wouldn't register my keypad inputs as the correct input, and it's a bit of a liability as the D-pad is also your movement, so while I sometimes used the proper defensive items, mostly the freeze blast, I usually went all out and used all of my defensive energy for the one offensive defensive ability. If you press up, down, up, fire, you'll fire Minions Special, which uses up most of your energy, but it also does significant damage and freezes your opponents, leaving them open to further damage. So as somebody who likes to primarily focus on offense rather than defense at a moment's notice, that was my usual go-to, especially against the bosses, because with bosses you can play cat and mouse, and so you can generally wait for your power bar to recharge, giving you more of an upper hand to get your bearings together than if you were fighting in a more crowded battlefield. I think as far as bosses go, the mid-game boss with Minion is definitely the better of the two. Is it because it takes place in my favorite battlefield in the series? Is it because it's really tough? Is it because Minion's attack is unique and devastating? Is it because it feels like a final boss that appears halfway through the game and so beating it feels like a bigger accomplishment than beating the final boss because you're less prepared? All of this and more. But the final boss is no slouch either. This is Darktooth, and Darktooth is canonically speaking Sweet Tooth's father, who was Charlie Kane in the previous game. But if you recall, I talked about how Twisted Metal 1 and 2 almost feel like they take place in separate series because of how different they are. Well, this is one of the reasons why. It's a bit of a lurch if you're familiar with the first game. Either way, the first stage is roughly on par with Minion as far as difficulty, except swap out a unique special attack for Sweet Tooth's special attack being fired like a machine gun. It definitely earns its status as a final boss, and the part where you think it's over, and then the figurehead on top of Darktooth comes to life, which launches you into a second phase, is definitely a pants-wetting moment the first time around. But it's weird. On more than one occasion, I've been known to destroy the second phase of Darktooth without even much effort. So a bit of better difficulty balancing wouldn't go amiss, and from there all you have are the endings, and on average I'd say this is probably the best collection of endings in the series. I would say another game has my favorite ending and story overall, but the batting average is definitely higher here. Axel wishing for the strength to face his dad, whom put him in the contraption, and defiantly ripping his own arms off to show his dad how much stronger he's become is the very essence of badass. Grasshopper reuniting with Calypso, who we learn was actually Calypso's daughter Krista, who died in the car accident that killed Calypso, is really touching. Only she was reanimated and fitted with a bomb, so they have a tearful reunion for a moment before sploding. Then there's Spectre, who wishes to be world famous, only for Calypso to stretch his face out with lips. Or the funniest one with me, Hammerhead, which I can't do justice, just watch.
Okay. We demand that you give us the ability to fly.
Certainly.
That is so cool.
Congratulations. I have granted your wish. Have a great time in the friendly skies.
Let's go! Wahoo! Hey, man, this can't be right.
Good thing these first-class tickets are refundable.
That is glorious. I could go over all these endings, but they're all good to great, with the exception of Sweet Tooth's and Warthog's, the former being nonsensical and then the latter just being lame. If you haven't gotten this impression by now, basically Twisted Metal 2 does everything right. Controls, gameplay, presentation, everything. It's the realization of what the first game set out to be, so in many respects, I find that Twisted Metal 2 is undisputedly the best game in the series. But it's also the least user-friendly. Now, I will fully admit that I'm still fairly new to these games compared to many, so I'm not exactly gonna be an MLG gamer god. Do kids still say MLG? But I will say that I've been playing these games for a good chunk of time now, and I've gotten fairly decent at them. I can beat every game in one go on medium and even a few on hard, so I can say from experience that I feel like this game is a good chunk harder than the other games. It comes across to me like the difficulty notch is cranked up 1 degree for every entry, meaning easy feels like what medium would be in other games, medium is like what hard would be in other games, and hard, well, it certainly doesn't lie. So they really make it worth your effort. I think the increased difficulty comes down to a few things. First of all, this is definitely not unique to Twisted Metal 2, but the AI really takes it easy on each other. If you find yourself running away and hoping the AI will go after each other, you'll be waiting a while, because they put very little effort into doing any damage to each other, whereas if you're around, they pretty much exclusively go after you. Dogpiling can be a very big issue in this game, and that can cause you very serious trouble, especially when they chain freeze blasts together and give you little to no room to get away. Also, the AI is maybe a little bit too smart. The idea of CPU players is that they're supposed to roughly emulate the appearance of real players, but a real player doesn't always aim with complete accuracy. These AIs know exactly where you're going to be and know exactly how to angle their shots with insane accuracy within a fraction of a second, whether you're in front of them or behind them. It just feels like the CPU is playing with a loaded deck of cards and expecting you to make do, and for the most part, I can make do. Like I said, I've beaten this game several times, but it can be irritating especially to a first-time player, and in that case, you may ask, well, why don't you play it on easy then? Well, that's the thing. I would say anybody's first playthrough of these games should be on easy until you get a handle on the controls, the level layouts, and the general feel for the game. But single track in this particular era had no patience for people who weren't quite up to snuff in that regard, and literally locks out half the game's content if you play it on easy. Something that would carry over to their next games, Critical Depth and Rogue Trip Vacation 2012. I mean, it's certainly ballsy to tell the audience that you'll play the game the way we like it or you miss out on half the content, and it's not like it was uncommon for game developers at this time to mess with people for playing on lower difficulties, but it's still annoying. It's a bit more of a commitment to be able to nail this one consistently. I'd say the series is generally very accessible for first-timers, but showing you the door halfway through if you're playing it on easy for me comes across as discouraging and makes it harder to get what feels like the intended experience. To me, accessibility counts for a lot, and I know the term accessibility is a bad word to some very stable geniuses out there, but I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to build up at your own pace without being forced to wear the dunce cap. But that's just me. And how can you become more confident in your abilities and get comfortable with the layout of a level if someone at a beginner level can't even play it? If there's one good thing I can say about Twisted Metal 3, and I mean like literally one good thing, what they do instead is if you're playing on easy, you just won't be able to see the character's ending, which to be fair, the endings in that game suck, so it's not like you're missing out on much. But at least it's the right idea. You won't lock any of the content behind the difficulty, so it gives the player a chance to experience the game at their own pace. But you hold something back to incentivize people to move up the ranks. It's incentive, not blatant restrictions. And I'm sure this is the type of thing that has defenders, but my question is this: if the game didn't operate like this and someone suggested it, would you really want it? Are you defending it because it genuinely makes the game a better experience, or are you defending it because it's just the way it is and therefore it's what you're used to? Food for thought. It's not for my sake, because I'm good enough to play on medium, but not quite hard, but that's a different story. And it's not for your sake either. It's for the sake of people who might want to take a chance on this game, but don't have the patience to break through the wall. So yes, I feel that despite being arguably the best game in the series mechanically, this one little turn of the knob makes me question whether or not it's the best game in the series. I would still argue that it's on the short list for the best games in the series, but it's not a slam dunk. I'd say it's a 2, possibly 3-way tie. But that does come with the caveat that, once again, at least 2 or 3 of the Twisted Metal games are basically perfect for what they are, and that's certainly the case for Twisted Metal 2, despite any criticisms I can levy at this game. It's still a fantastic game top to bottom that I could pop in and play anytime. And it's definitely the game that I think exemplifies what it means to be a Twisted Metal game, possibly more than any other. With that said, a success this big should have propelled Single Track into the new millennium with style. Unfortunately, this is where things went wrong for them. Single Track seemingly wanted to branch out and do their own thing. They wanted to become a games publisher, they wanted to branch out and work on different platforms, they wanted to be their own people. So they decided to say adios to Twisted Metal and Sony in order to move on to greener pastures. Unfortunately, it turns out those greener pastures were only greener because they were covered in toxic waste. They would be bought out by GT Interactive, and after a few good games, most of the senior staff left, and their games became more and more mediocre, culminating with a licensed Animorphs platformer before Single Track breathed its last. But as soon as their deal with Sony ended, there was one issue for both parties. Single Track owned the engine that Twisted Metal was made on, however, Sony owned the actual intellectual property. So this put the franchise in a bit of a complicated position, and the resulting game, well, let's just say wasn't exactly A-level material. So the next game we'll discuss will be the interminable, the abominable, Twisted Metal 3. Until then, if you like what I do here and want to support the channel financially, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, such as early access, Discord benefits, ad-free viewing, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to users Brooklyn, D-Betch, Gaw004, Cotton Swab, Layabout, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Raf, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. And if you want to support the channel for free, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, as I'm still pretty sure YouTube is not publishing my videos to people's subscription feeds. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!